What's up, guys? As I'm sure you will know, it is a big weekend for UK MMA. UFC 286 goes down this Saturday night. I thought it was a good opportunity to have a look back at the UFC London card that got away from us. The one that was supposed to take place in March 2020. It obviously got called off because of the pandemic, but it was the first event that the UFC had to cancel because of it. So it was very late notice whether it was going to happen or not. They tried to move some of the fights to Vegas, apparently at late notice, off the top of my head, and some of the fights tried to get rebooked for Cage Warriors, which took place the night before, behind closed doors, which must have been the last MMA event to happen for quite some time, probably until the UFC came back, I would imagine. So I've pulled up the card on Wikipedia. Not that it's the go-to source, but, you know, it's just easy. It lists all the fights. I'm just going to give my reactions to some of these matchups, because we never got to see them. At least I assume we didn't, unless some of them got rebooked for a later date. So according to Wikipedia, the card started with Bartosz Fabinski, who, if you remember, he ended up fighting Darren Stewart on the Cage Warriors card. We'll talk about that when we get further up the card. He was supposed to face a debuting Shavkat Rakhmonov. Man, how did we miss out on the Shavkat debut? That is absolutely gutting. That would have been really good. The second fight of the night, another big debut for the man Tom Aspinall, who was supposed to face Jake Collier. I believe he did make his debut against Jake Collier at a later date. I assume it was the Till versus Whitaker Fight Island card. Tom Aspinall debut in London, that would have been lovely. Would have been very excited for that. You got John Phillips versus Dusko Todorovic. Off the top of my head, is that fight obviously didn't happen. Same as pretty much all these fights, I assume. I assume then John Phillips went on to face Hamzat, which is not fun. And Todorovic is obviously facing Christian Leroy Duncan this Saturday night, who's making his UFC debut, which of course I'm very excited about, if you know anything about me. The next matchup we had was Mike Grundy versus Makwan Amirkhani. This is a fight that we have actually seen, because it got rescheduled. We saw it last year. Makwan won in the first round. Makwan is obviously back this Saturday to face Jack Shaw. We'll talk about him a little bit later on in the video. Then you have Molly McCann versus Ashley Evans Smith. Molly was on a great run going into this card. I remember that much. She ended up facing Tyler Santos on that Till card, so that's a rough replacement opponent or replacement matchup, I suppose, to get as a reschedule. You had Lerone Murphy in his second UFC fight after his draw out in Abu Dhabi that a lot of people thought he won, myself included. He would have been facing Gabriel Benitez. The Lerone Murphy London curse continues. Well, starts here, I suppose. I remember Lerone making jokes that the reason it didn't happen is because he was on the card and it was just he was never going to get to fight in London. Obviously, at the time of recording, fingers crossed he still is by the time you see this, but Lerone is still fighting on this weekend's London card despite his fight with Nathaniel Wood falling off the card. He's got a replacement opponent, so buzzing for Lerone Murphy that he gets to stay on the card. That's the main thing. Then you have Paul Craig versus Ryan Spann. I think this is a fight that could be made probably right now, and would make a lot of sense with both of them coming off of losses in their last fights. I remember that Paul Craig had a break between the Shogun fights. They had the first one that went to a draw, and then he won the second one. But there was some fights in between, if I'm not wrong. So I assume this was one of them. I think that's a tough fight for Paul Craig, honestly. Ryan Spann. Yeah. There you go. They, like I said, they could make that fight right now, and I'd probably be like, yeah, good matchup. So, fair play. Mark Casey versus Jai Herbert. This was a fun one to talk about in the build-up to this card, because Jai was making his UFC debut and everyone was like, why is he fighting Mark Casey on his debut? That's so difficult. And since then, all we've done is say, why is Jai Herbert fighting this guy in his second, third, fourth UFC fight? He's fighting Ludwig Klein this weekend, another tough matchup. So the Jai Herbert only fights killers thing started on this card, and we didn't even get to see the fight. Reminds me a lot of the Lerone Murphy Nathaniel Wood fight that we were supposed to get this Saturday, where I love both guys. Would have been a great fight. Don't want to see either of them lose, though. Big fan of March Casey, big fan of Jai Herbert, so that would have been difficult to watch to some degree. You had Jack Shaw on the main card taking on Geraldo de Freitas, who I don't believe he ended up facing. I believe he got a different opponent for when he fought on Fight Island. Jack Shaw would have been his second appearance in the UFC after he submitted Nohelin Hernandez in Copenhagen. Don't know too much about Geraldo de Freitas, although I remember writing previews for it. It's been a while, okay. Then you had Darren Stewart versus Marvin Vettori. I kind of wish we had seen this fight because I think it probably would have been mad. Darren, like I said, ended up facing Bartosz Fabinski on the Cage Warriors card and losing, so wasn't a great week for the dentist. And obviously we've got Marvin Vettori in London this week facing Roman Dolidze, so clearly they have plans for Vettori to compete in London at some point down the line. Then you had Jack Marshman versus Kevin Holland. From the top of my head, Jack Marshman has probably only had one fight since then. If that. I'm not actually too sure. Kevin Holland, this was right before his run, like his incredible run that I believe happened in 2021 when he won like 5 fights or whatever it was. So I would have loved to see Kevin Holland compete on this card. I was a fan of him from watching him on the Contender Series. And I hope that we get to see him in the UK at some point. I think that would be a lot of fun. Co-main event, another one of these. I don't want either guy to lose, but what a banger of a matchup. Danny Roberts versus Nicholas Dalby. 2 former Cage Warriors vets. Both always put on incredible fights. I actually spoke to Nicholas Dalby about this fight in the build-up to the event. I was still in uni at the time, so that says it all. I don't actually know whether I still have the footage of that interview because it wasn't used for anything. I only used it for some uni work that I was doing. So if I still have the video of that interview, here it is.
It seems like one of those fights that would be easy to put together just based on your style, his style. All the fans are going to want to see it. So is that how it felt to you when they offered you it? Like it's a bit of a no-brainer, like sort of thing.
Yeah, it was a great fight to get, for sure. Yeah, really great stylistical matchup, and like he comes to take people's sets off, and I do the same. So it should be a barn burner. I feel like probably name-wise, Cowboy was a bigger fight. That doesn't mean I'm looking past Danny, but I do sense that all the hardcore fans, they know it's equal level quality of competition. So the majority for this fight, when it got announced, they were like not indifferent, but it didn't got us as big a reaction as the last fight. But I could sense from all the hardcore fans that they were like, "Ooh, this is gonna be a nice one."
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those fights that the closer we get, the closer, the more anticipation there is. Because it's one of those fights where when you look at a card, that's the one you pick out. Do you see the fight sort of going like that, where it's going to be? It feels like, from watching a lot of your fights and watching a lot of Danny's, doesn't feel like there's really any opportunity for this to be a dull fight. I don't think I've ever seen either of you in a dull fight. So
no, it's not going to be a dull fight, not at all. And I think UFC putting it in as the co-main event, that kind of shows what they're expecting as well.
But what a matchup! And I don't know where both guys are at right now, but again, I think that's another fight they could make right now, and I would be really excited to see it, even though I don't want to see either guy lose, because big fan of Danny Roberts, big fan of the Locomotivo Nicholas Dalby. Main event, this was the one that really hurt when it got cancelled. Tyron Woodley versus Leon Edwards. Whilst I wasn't super excited about the matchup, I struggled to get excited about Tyron Woodley fights. What can I say? I feel like everyone feels that way. This felt like Leon Edwards' opportunity he had been waiting for. A fight against the former champ who was coming off of his loss to Usman. A really winnable fight, I felt like, for Leon. Obviously, we've seen Tyron's career trajectory since then. A very winnable fight for Leon Edwards. And it just would have been a huge moment for him headlining the O2. I was convinced the whole time that Tyron wasn't going to make the trip over. He seemed so dead against it the whole time. And we didn't get to see the fight. And obviously what was the most disappointing thing was Leon didn't even get the rematch. Not the rematch, but the rescheduled fight, because they ended up going with Gilbert Burns. Gilbert absolutely dominated Tyron Woodley in that fight. And it really felt like that was Leon's shot. Leon didn't fight that year either because of the cancellations with Khamzat Chimaev. And so I guess his next fight was Nate Diaz, which really puts into perspective how long Leon Edwards has had to wait for these moments. The title shot against Usman, and now obviously defending it this Saturday night. It would have been cool to see him headline the O2 against Woodley, but it does feel extra special that this is the first time he's headlining a UK show, and it's the title defense against Usman. So, silver linings, I suppose. Let me know your feelings on this card, guys. Is there any matchups that you would like to still see? Probably not Edwards versus Woodley, if we're being honest. But let me know in the comments. And of course, enjoy UFC 286 this Saturday night. I cannot wait.